Thank you so much. Thank you so much. All right. Absolutely no need for me here tonight. That was terrific and great. And I feel very old, too. It is, as always, enormous pleasure to be in Asheville. It's kind of an indulgence, really, on my part to come here, because I know I'm really not needed at all, that you all know exactly what to do, and I know that I think maybe people already acknowledge some of the people from here who came down to Washington to help us, and it was so great also to know that there were all these students in solidarity. That same day we were circling the White House and things. This is a good and important and powerful place, and I'm so happy to be here. And I apologize in advance. I don't think you're going to get an amazing speech out of me. I'm not sure I'm a writer, not a speaker anyway, but I'm worn out a little bit. It's been a long fall and been on the road the whole time. And I'm very sorry to have missed the beginning of this. I was doing a radio interview back to my home state of Vermont with the governor. And we were talking for an hour on the sort of statewide radio network about the recovery in Vermont from Hurricane Irene, which just completely devastated our place. And of course, much of the discussion that we were having was about climate change and what it means. So I'm going to start there for a minute, if it's okay. I know you know all about global warming, and that it's kind of, in a sense, pointless to repeat it a little bit, but I want to just make certain that we're all on exactly the same page, because it's the scale of the problem that dictates the scale of the response that we need, okay? And so I'll just quickly talk about where we are. When I wrote The End of Nature 22 years ago, the only thing we didn't know really was, we knew that you put carbon in the atmosphere, its molecular structure would trap heat. We just didn't know how fast it was going to pinch. And the story of the last 20 years is it's pinching harder and faster than we suspected it would. The Earth turned out to be much more finely balanced than we understood. And in the lifetimes of the people in this room, we've managed to take the Earth out of the Holocene, out of that 10,000 year period of benign climatic stability that underwrote the rise of human civilization, and now we're into something else, and the only question is how far into it we're going to go. So far, we've raised the temperature of the Earth about 1 degree. We've got about 3/4 of a watt of extra solar energy per square meter of the Earth's surface being trapped by that denser atmosphere. And those things don't sound like so much, but in fact they've been enough to really and decisively change things. I called this most recent book of mine by the odd title of Earth with the extra A. You have to kind of channel your inner Schwarzenegger to pronounce sort of Earth. And the conceit of the title was just that we'd changed the place enough that it deserved, a slightly new name. Same number of continents, gravity still applies, but, seawater's about 30% more acid than it was 30 years ago. As the chemistry changes, it absorbs carbon from the atmosphere. There's a few people in here who are like me, old enough to remember when those first pictures came back from Apollo 8 of the beautiful blue-white marble floating in the black void of space. Those pictures are as out of date as my high school yearbook picture. There's in the summer about 40% less ice in the Arctic than there was then. Enormous changes in the 18 months or so since that book came out. Just the kind of horrific proof of what's going on. 2010 was the warmest year for which we have records. 19 nations set new all-time temperature records last year, itself a record, and some of them were staggering. We were on the phone one day with our 350.org crew in Pakistan, and someone said, it's hot here today. And I was surprised to hear them say it. It was July, and it's always hot in Pakistan in July. And he said, no, it's really hot. We just set the new all-time Asia temperature record today. It's 129 degrees. Like, okay, that is indeed hot. And when you get heat like that, all kinds of things happen. I could talk for a long time about all those different kind of things. Let's just talk tonight about one manifestation, and that's the way that water is moving around the planet, the changes that we've managed to inflict on the hydrological cycles of the Earth. If you wanted one physical fact to understand the century now unfolding, it is the very simple piece of physics that says warm air holds more water vapor than cold. Warm air holds more water vapor than cold. Because we've raised the temperature a degree, the atmosphere is 4% moister than it was 40 years ago on average. That is a staggering change in a basic physical parameter of this planet. And what it means is that in dry areas, we're seeing way more evaporation and drought. In summer 2010, it was Russia, the worst heat wave. They'd never gotten to 100 degrees in Moscow in 250 years of record keeping, but it was over 100 day after day after day at the beginning of August, and big fires and things. But the most significant result was that the Kremlin got completely scared about the dwindling harvest, and they stopped all grain export to the rest of the world, turned ships around. In a normal year, Russia is the third biggest grain exporter in the country, in the world. And so that cessation immediately caused a spike in the price of grain, 60, 70%. Grain prices have stayed like that ever since because we've had one failed harvest after another. Oxfam put out a report today detailing what it's meant. What it's meant is that we have about 200, 300 million more starving people on the planet than we did a couple of years ago. The long, painfully slow decline in the number of malnourished people has reversed. And those numbers are now rising and rising fast because of that climatic disruption. Right now, of course, you can see horrific, historic drought in the Horn of Africa. And on our continent, in the Southwest, in Texas and Oklahoma and New Mexico, where it's drier than it was even in the depths of the Dust Bowl. A few weeks ago, there's a big firestorm that swept through Austin, through its suburbs, burned a lot of houses, killed some people. The head of the Texas Forest Firefighting Service said, no human being has ever fought fire in conditions like this before. And he was essentially correct. The humidity was approaching zero. The temperature was off the charts. It was just tailor-made for conflagration. Just like it's also tailor-made for flood now, because once that water's evaporated up into the atmosphere, water vapor only stays in the atmosphere on average 6 or 7 days before it comes down. We've loaded the dice for deluge, and that's what we're getting. Pakistan, 2010. There's a region up in the Khyber Pass that normally gets about 3 feet of rain in a year, and it got 12 feet of rain in a week. And that's why the Indus River swelled to the point where it covered a quarter of the country, and 20 million people were out of their homes. And then last Christmas, right around now, it started in Australia, and you'll remember those epic pictures of Queensland, and there weren't as many pictures because there aren't as many cameras in Vietnam or in the Philippines, but that's what was happening there too. In the spring, it was the Mississippi and the Missouri just carrying record levels of water and overflowing their banks in place after place after place. Vermont, as I said, got its turn in August. Hurricane Irene came walloping up the east coast of the country, and as it passed over record warm seawater over New York and New Jersey, off New York and New Jersey, it picked up an amazing load of water, and then it dumped it on Vermont. We set new rainfall records, and when I say we set new rainfall records, we have 250 years of record keeping in a place like Vermont, as you would here. And that means that there have been thousands upon thousands of storms over the years. So the chance of setting a new record is small, but if you were to set one, it should only be by a millimeter or a quarter of an inch or something. Instead, we broke the old one-day rainfall records by 25%. Binghamton, New York broke its old one-day record by 60%, okay? This is rain falling on a different planet, and if you didn't even really need a rain gauge to tell you. You may have seen pictures on the news of those covered bridges that had stood there for 200 years, taking everything that nature could pour at them, just floating away down swollen rivers. It was horrible to watch. It was horrible to watch, and one of the things it demonstrated to me, reminded me, was that we really do have to work at many levels. My real affection is for building strong local economies. That's what mostly I've been writing about in recent years. And Vermont's a perfect example of that. We've done more than most places, like here, to build a beautiful local food system, okay? And I mean, I wrote a book, part of which a book called Deep Economy some years ago, that described, among other things, a year of feeding my family with nothing that didn't grow in our valley, It's been quite remarkable, and it was quite remarkable and quite horrifying to see how much of that local agricultural infrastructure washed away in August, how many beautiful farms are now covered with a foot of sand, and on and on and on. It made me realize that it was probably a good thing that I've spent very little time in Vermont in the last few years, because we've been on the road with this larger fight. If we can't begin to win this fight, then we're not going to be able to protect our home places. And of course, and this is something to bear in mind, at least in a place like Vermont, we've helped cause the problem. That's not true really very much in places like Central America, which 6 weeks ago saw the worst flooding it's ever had. El Salvador got the worst rain, 500 people dead across that region. Not really true in Thailand, where right now Bangkok, one of the great cities on earth, the kind of cradle of Buddhist civilization, is half submerged in the worst monsoon flooding they've ever had, on and on and on. It's a big moral dilemma, in other words, along with being a big practical one. And here's the thing to keep always in mind, we're still near the beginning of this. We've raised the temperature of the Earth 1 degree. But there's another degree in the pipeline from carbon we've already emitted. Heat is held in the oceans for a while, but not that long. We're looking at 2 degrees anyway. The climatologists, who have been right so far about everything, tell us that unless we get our act together fast, and by getting our act together, I mean stop burning coal and gas and oil far more quickly than any government on earth is now planning, unless we do that, then we're going to see 4 or 5 or 6 degrees before the century is out, and much of that will be locked in the very near future. We can't deal with that. The agronomists at Stanford and the University of Washington put out a study last year just trying to ask the question, what would happen to our basic food crops, corn and wheat and soybeans and rice, which evolved in the Holocene just like we did? What would happen to them if we raised the temperature like that? And what they said was, even before you account for flood and drought, just the increased temperature, from this point on, every degree that we increase the global average temperature will cut grain yields about 10%. You can do the math. Think about the things that you care about peace, about development, about social justice, about women's progress, about all the things that we work so hard for around the world. Try to imagine what will happen to those on a planet with 20 or 30% fewer calories than we have at the moment. Nothing good will happen. We just cannot let that happen. There's never been a human challenge more important than this one. We can't let it happen, so we've got to figure out what to do. And that's what I want to talk about mostly, and I'll do it as quickly as I can. Let's begin by acknowledging a few things. One is that the scientific method worked really well. Scientists did a terrific job of coming to terms with a difficult problem in chemistry and physics, and cracking it and providing us with a robust consensus around which to work. And the engineering method has worked well too. 20 years ago, when we talked about solar power and wind power, these things were still kind of on the horizon. No longer the case. We know how to do much of what we need to do now. We have beautiful examples of this technology all over the place, sometimes in unlikely places. Let me give you an example about the engineering method and its strengths and what limits it. I was in China not long ago doing a big piece for the National Geographic on China and energy, and I spent a lot of there's a lot of things that Chinese are doing wrong. They're putting up, just like we did 100 years ago, an endless array of coal-fired power plants. But there's things they're doing right too, and one of them is really going after renewable energy hard. Half of the world's installed renewable energy capacity is solar hot water panels in China. Okay? 250 million Chinese, about 25% of the country, when they take a shower at night, the hot water is coming off these solar thermal panels on the roof, which are not very difficult technology. They work terrifically well. I have them on my house, but fewer than 1% of Americans have them, way fewer than 1%. I spent a day with the guy, the engineer, now billionaire, who runs the biggest of these solar thermal companies, a guy named Huang Ming, at his headquarters, what they call the Sun Moon Mansion in 3 hours south of Beijing. And we had a great day as he explained to me how they built out all this solar power, all the solar thermal stuff all over China. And then he said at the end of the day, come into my little museum here. He had a little museum off his office, and some of it was the traditional pictures of him shaking hands with important people and things, but right in the middle of it, the sort of dominating artifact was a kind of old, rusting solar hot water panel. He said, you know what that is? No, I don't know what that is. What is it? He said, that's one of the solar panels that Jimmy Carter put on the roof of the White House in 1979 and Ronald Reagan took down in 1985, okay? And that was one of those moments when it just struck you that as well as the scientific method and the engineering method had worked, that's how badly the political method has failed in dealing with this problem. That's where the rub is, okay? And that's what we've got to talk about. I'm no expert in politics of any kind, in political change. My first analysis of how change would happen when I was 27 and wrote The End of Nature, my first analysis of what would be required would be for me to write a book, and then people would read it and everybody would change. A lot of people did read it. It came out in 24 languages and it was a bestseller in some of them and things, but it turns out that's not really how it works. The sort of second analysis that I think an awful lot of people shared because it was completely reasonable was the idea that our scientists would sit down with our political leaders and explain that the worst thing that ever happened in the world was happening, and explain that we had relatively straightforward ways of dealing with it. Most importantly, putting some price on carbon to reflect the damage that it does in the atmosphere. And that they would do this, and that we would get about the difficult but possible business of making the transition off fossil fuel. And that model, the model of the kind of experts sitting and talking with our political leaders, that's how it should work. That's what should have worked, and that's what we tried. And We tried it for a long time, and maybe the most powerful example of that was Al Gore just sort of showing people over and over again his slideshow and sitting down with the powerful over and over and over again. The part that we hadn't figured out was that while experts were talking rationally to politicians in one ear, the fossil fuel industry was going to be bellowing in the other ear, and bellowing this toxic mix of threats and promises that would paralyze the political process and keep anything from happening. We have in Washington a perfect 25-year, unblemished, bipartisan record of accomplishing nothing, okay? And it is entirely due to the power of the fossil fuel industry to prevent change. Let's think for a minute about what their stake in all of this is. They are making more money right now than any enterprise in the history of human enterprise. Exxon made more money last quarter than any company in the history of money, okay? And they broke their own record, and they're broken their own record 6 years in a row, and all the other oil companies and coal companies are doing the same thing. They are minting money. So much money that a tiny percentage of it is all that's required to kind of warp our political system to prevent change from happening. And that's exactly what's going on. They are defending the greatest sweetheart deal that there ever was, okay? Their business model is, we get to use the Earth's atmosphere as an open sewer into which to dump for free our main waste product, okay? That's why they're so immensely profitable. And if they had to account for that waste, they wouldn't be making as much money. No business would. I mean, if you ran a restaurant in Asheville, and at the end of every day you just took the garbage from the restaurant and tossed it out in the middle of the street, you would be more profitable because you wouldn't have to pay someone to haul it away. But pretty soon Asheville would not be a good place. There would be rats in the streets and it would stink and all of that. Well, on a larger scale, that's exactly what's going on in our atmosphere. And that power of those guys to make that, to delay action, to keep that business model going for a little while longer, that's what we're up against all over the world. That's why my colleagues who are in Durban, South Africa tonight are making, watching yet another pointless 2-week exercise in nothing happening in this UN. I mean, it goes on and on and on. So, at some point in the last few years, some of us began to figure out belatedly that we were going to have to figure out some other currency to work in. We're never going to match these guys in their preferred currency, money. We were going to have to figure out other things. We were going to have to build movements. That's what it was going to take, all right? We started 350.org in January of 2008. Our greatest climatologist, Jim Hansen, and his team at NASA put out a paper saying, we know enough about carbon in the atmosphere to know how much is too much. Any value for carbon in the atmosphere greater, they said, than 350 parts per million is not compatible with the planet on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted. That's strong and sobering language for scientists to use, and it's stronger still if you know that wherever you are today, in Asheville or in Australia, the atmosphere outside is about 393 parts per million CO2 and growing 2 parts per million per year. We're already way too high. That's why Pakistan drowns and Texas burns, So it was a horrifying paper to read, but it did give us, as we were thinking about this sort of nascent movement building challenge, something to work with. The problem with trying to organize the globe is that the globe is a large place and everyone on it insists on speaking their own language, okay? And that makes it very hard to have like I mean, even if you have all the money in the world, it's hard. There's a few people here who are old enough like me to remember when Coca-Cola's slogan, and Coke has quite a bit of money, their slogan was, "Coke adds life." Okay, do you remember that? They had to drop that because it turned out that in many places around the world they were spending a lot of their money to put up billboards that said, in effect, "Coke brings your ancestors back from the dead." And this was not turned out not to be a useful sales pitch. And so faced with that problem, the solution that hit us was that Arabic numerals translated across linguistic boundaries. You wouldn't normally pick a wonky scientific data point to rally around, but at least 350 meant the same thing wherever you were. So that's what we started trying to do. It was about, we didn't have any money, and we had me and 7 undergraduates at Middlebury College in Vermont. That's what we started with in January of '08. And well, actually, 7 was a good number. There are indeed 7 continents. Each one of them took one. The guy who took the Antarctic also had to take the internet. It's sort of its own land mass. And off we went, and our job was to find people like ourselves all over the world. Most places there's not necessarily a category called environmentalist, but everywhere there are people worried about public health, about women's issues, about food, about development, about progress, about all the things that can't happen on a degrading world, all the things that no one's working on in Thailand right now because they're just trying to keep people's heads above water, and so we tried to find those. We did these training camps in places like in Turkey for Central Asia, and in the Caribbean, and we did one in Johannesburg. We brought a couple of young people from every country in Africa. Now, most had never been on an airplane or left their own home nation, but they were great organizers. And we told everybody all around the world, including very good people here in Asheville, said, we're going to pick one day and make it kind of the coming out party for this number. And almost arbitrarily, we picked October 24th of 2009, so just about exactly 2 years ago. Told everybody to do something. And we didn't know how well this would work. We got the first sense it might really do okay 2 days early on October 22nd. We were sitting in New York in this borrowed one-room office, all 8 of us with our laptops open doing press releases and things, but the phone rang and it was a 17-year-old girl from Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, Lily, who was she and her 18-year-old sister were our organizers there, and she was almost in tears on the phone. And she was saying, the government's taken away our permit for Saturday. Ethiopia, not always a really nice government. They've taken away our permit. We can't do it. We're doing it today before they can stop us, okay? We're so sorry. We don't mean to jump the gun. We wanted to do this at the same time as everybody else. We don't want to spoil it for everybody. And we have 10,000 kids right now out in the street chanting 350. So I was like, don't worry about the date too much. It's okay. And that was really great. For the next 72 hours, pictures just rolled in from every corner of the planet. There were 5,100 demonstrations in 181 countries. CNN said it was the most widespread day of political action in the planet's history. And the pictures were so beautiful. If you haven't seen them, go to 350.org and take a look at some of the many pictures from then and subsequent things. One of the things you'll see, and this is important, is that the old trope that I'd been told 1,000 times that environmentalism was a kind of luxury for rich white people who'd taken care of their other problems, and that if you had to worry where your next meal was coming from, you wouldn't be an environmentalist, that just turned out to be nonsense. Most of the people that we work with around the world are poor and black and brown and Asian and young, because that's what most of the world is made up of. and oddly enough, just as interested in the future as anybody else. Maybe more so, because the future bears down harder on you in a lot of places than it does here. It was really beautiful to see, and it's been beautiful to see in subsequent. We've done this twice more, most recently, again, with big help from people here. It's a huge day of action in this September that we called Moving Planet, and it was mostly bicycle-based all around the planet, because bicycles are a part of the solution we need, and because bicycles are a great symbol of solidarity, one of the few tools that both rich and poor use around the world. And it was glorious and beautiful, and we're going to keep doing this kind of big education because we've got to spread the word constantly about the biggest problem we've ever faced. It's completely fantastic, and it isn't enough. We also are figuring out that we've got to get more direct in the work that we do, and that's been the story of the last few months. And I'll just tell this story real briefly because people have already told it better than I have tonight, better than I can. But this pipeline thing was really interesting. We should have been outraged and alarmed about the tar sands in Canada some years ago. And our indigenous brothers and sisters up there were shouting loudly, spreading the alarm, talking about how their world was literally being turned upside down. I literally, I mean, they've only gotten 3% of the oil out of those tar sands, but they've already moved more earth than they did to build the Suez Canal and the Great Wall of China and the 10 biggest dams on earth combined, okay? So it's horrible, and you can go to Google Earth and look at it and see how horrible it is. We should have been outraged in action. But you know, there's like 500 things like that going on someplace around the world on any given day, and how do you know, how are you able to be dealing with all of them? You just can't, or I can't. I got more focused in the spring when Jim Hansen at NASA did the calculations about how much carbon was up there. They said, this is the second largest pool of carbon on Earth after the oil fields of Saudi Arabia. Now, it was burning the oil fields of Saudi Arabia more than anything else that has raised the temperature of the planet a degree. But when we found those oil fields, we didn't know about global warming, so there's no huge moral onus on us, I suppose. If we find the second Saudi Arabia, and knowing what we now know, just do the same thing, then we're just crazy. What he said was, if you could take somehow, you can't, thank God, but if you could somehow tonight torch off all that oil all at once, it would be enough to raise the CO2 concentration of the atmosphere from its present 390 parts per million to about 540 parts per million. That's how much carbon's up there, okay? He said if you tap them heavily, it's, quote, essentially game over for the climate. And when he said that, it made me realize that we needed to go to work. Though the odds were very long, we needed to at least try, and so we sent out this letter. I wrote it, and good people signed on to help. Naomi Klein and Wendell Berry and a bunch of indigenous leaders, and we sent it out and asked people to come to DC at the end of the summer and get arrested. We had no idea really who would show up, because it had been a while since there'd been kind of mass civil disobedience in this country. And the first day was supposed to last for 2 weeks. That first Saturday, 80 of us showed up to get arrested. And this was more than we'd expected, and it was more than the police had expected. And the police weren't pleased with it, and they especially weren't pleased with the idea that there'd be more people coming day after day for the next 2 weeks. And so they said, we're not going to do what we normally do, which is arrest you and take you away to the police station and fine you $100 and release you. What we're going to do is crack down on you guys on the theory that this will deter the next people from coming. So the first 80 of us who showed up spent we got the sort of full tour. We spent 3 days in what they call Central Cell Block in DC, which is exactly as pleasant as it sounds like it might be. You know, much of it kind of shackled at the ankle to the wall and things, and there were one bologna sandwich at 3 a.m. and another at 3 p.m. and 6 ounces of water with each one, and it was reasonably grim, but not so bad, because about 24 hours in, word leaked into the prison that the next day, on the Sunday, 100 people had shown up to get arrested, even knowing they might have to go to jail. In fact, they didn't have to. The police, there was basically no more jail to put people in. So after that, they started treating people a little better, taking them away in handcuffs, putting them in a paddy wagon, but releasing them after a few hours. Before the 2 weeks was over, 1,253 people had been arrested. It was, I don't know if any, there's some pictures. It was the largest civil disobedience action that had taken place in this country in about 35 years. There's some of the indigenous delegation, and you can see people had the phone numbers for the lawyers written on their forearms. But it was remarkable and beautiful scene day after day after day there in front of the White House, and it was really beautiful. What we did with our bodies, which is sort of sometimes what civil disobedience is about, what we did with our bodies was ante up, like in a poker game, and paid the ante to get in the game. And after that, we'd taken what had been an obscure issue. Probably many of you hadn't heard of the Keystone Pipeline until this summer, or the tar sands, and turned it into a national and even an international issue, because of course our 350 friends around the world were doing great stuff. They were sitting in at Canadian and American embassies all over the world and shutting them down in some places, and it was really powerful. Once we were in the game, we played hard, and every place that President Obama went in the course of the fall, there were people, mostly young people, who were gathering there to let him know what they thought, including here in Asheville. And I was really grateful when people on very short notice turned out when the president came through, and the chant every place was the same: yes, we can stop the pipeline, you know? And of course, as many people here, and I see the beautiful orange vests, came to the White House on just about 3.5 weeks ago, on November 6th. We decided that we didn't need to get arrested again. We decided we'd try to encircle the White House. I just thought it sounded kind of cool to do that, you know? And we didn't know if we could do it, because no one had really tried it before, and all my younger, more technologically savvy counterparts were all on, of course, on Google Earth, trying to count how many people it would take to go around the White House. And we figured that if we, got there and really stretched arms and stuff, we might just make it. As it turned out, we needn't have worried, because we were shoulder to shoulder, 5 deep around the White House most of the way. And there were wonderful, there's Mark Ruffalo, the great anti-fracking activist and actor, and Lennox Yearwood, the head of the Hip Hop Caucus, who's a wonderful guy and gave an amazing talk, as he always does. And what he said was, this is our lunch counter moment, for our generation. And it was powerful to hear. And there's Dr. Hansen, always a great hero. And the indigenous delegations, as always, and just people of great power and beauty, fanning out everywhere. And it didn't hurt that it was one of the prettiest days of the whole year either. It was a beautiful scene. And 4 days later, the president announced that the pipeline would be delayed, and that there would be a serious review, and that the review would, among other things, take into account climate change. And this was no unbelievable victory, There are really no final victories in environmental things. All victories are temporary, and this one may be especially temporary. I mean, after the election, I mean, look, today there's senators introduced a bill to try and speed the review of the pipeline, Republican senators, and they might get away with that, though I don't think so. And the president might, President Obama might, after the election, decide to approve the pipeline. No, I don't really think so, but he might turn it down and approve some other one. And, President Romney, or heaven forbid, President Gingrich might approve 151 pipelines. I have no doubt that if the Koch brothers told Mitt Romney that he was to frack Old Faithful so that it blew gas instead of water, he would just ask how high they wanted it to go, and even and at the same time, we're fighting because they're trying to put 2 more pipelines west through Canada to take tar sands oil to the Pacific. I don't think they're going to happen, because I was just up in Vancouver. The First Nations people up there are so tough and so strong, and they have more rights than American tribes. In British Columbia, they didn't sign treaties for the most part, and so it's very hard to get across their land, and they're really taking this as a spiritual fight, among other things. And meanwhile, in Europe, we're fighting like crazy to try and keep the EU from allowing tar sands oil into Europe. There was a big story on the front page of The Guardian on Monday about how the British government was lobbying the rest of Europe to let it in, and I wrote a big op-ed piece just saying what a travesty this was, and we're fighting hard there. Even if we won the battle against tar sands, in the context of climate change, it wouldn't make any kind of overwhelming difference. We've got plenty of other places that we're pouring carbon into the atmosphere. There's thousands of pipelines and oil wells and coal mines, and we just do not have enough. It would take thousands of little Dutch boys to put fingers in every possible dike that we're surrounded by. We're not going to do it that way. So the lesson is not that the pipeline thing was unimportant. It was really important. The lesson is that it taught us a little bit about what we're up against and how we're going to proceed, what we're going to have to do if we're going to really change the tide, what kind of tactics and approach and everything else are going to work. It taught us that sometimes you can stand up to corporations and corporate power if you do it really firmly. And I got to say, there were parts of it that were awfully nice. TransCanada Pipeline, who had done their best to corrupt the political process, who had paid off people across Washington in an effort to ensure this pipeline, they were certain they were going to win. 6 weeks ago, National Journal, which is the kind of insider's Bible in Washington, published a poll of 300 energy insiders, staffers on the Hill, lobbyists. 97% of them said that TransCanada would have their permit by the end of this year to be building that pipeline. TransCanada was so certain they were going to win that about 7 weeks ago, they mowed the entire 1,700-mile stretch of the pipeline so they'd be all set to put it in. Now, I'm a Methodist Sunday school teacher, so I'm not supposed to think in this way, but the fact that TransCanada has like $500 million worth of pipe sitting in fields across the Midwest rusting makes me really, really happy, I gotta say. But we're not going to do this one pipeline at a time. If we're going to do it, it's going to be by figuring out what the larger game looks like. And what the larger game looks like, I think, is breaking some of the corporate power now dominating our political life. And I got to say, this struck me much harder this year than it had before. Because when Jim Hansen said that thing about if you tap the tar sands heavily, it's essentially game over for the climate, you would think that that would have been enough to slow people down. You would think that any government or really any company would say, okay, well then we guess we shouldn't do that. You know, that would be a bad plan. Let's do something else. That's not a good idea. But no one said that. No one, except those people who came to get arrested. Nobody said, we can't do this. That's what corporate power looks like. And one of the things that we've allowed to happen in this country, I mean, I went to Occupy Wall Street right at the beginning, within a few days of it starting, and got to speak through the big human microphone down in Lower Manhattan, which was really fun. And the thing that I said was, thank you. Wall Street's been occupying the atmosphere for 25 years. That's why we can't get anything done. So it's a really good thing that we're returning the favor now, you know, and it really is. The Occupy movement and its understanding of what's going on is exactly what we need. We fell into this trap, thanks in part to the Supreme Court and the power of corporations over even that, into this trap of deciding that corporations were people and that they should be able to spend as much money as they wanted to around elections. And that's what they've done. The Chamber of Commerce really did spend more money last cycle than the Republican and Democratic national committees combined, and 97% of it went to climate deniers, okay? Corporations aren't people. And that's a really important thing to understand and to do something about. And when I say they aren't people, I don't mean that they're like bad people or evil people, or I mean they're not people, okay? People are extraordinarily interesting and complex and contradictory. We have all these emotions and instincts, and we have histories, and we have great attachment to those who came before and to those who will come after, and we can be gratuitously cruel and deeply good, and we have, you know, all these odd things like art and religion and whatever that play on us, and corporations aren't like that, okay? They're not good, they're not evil, they're simple. They're like, you know, it's like if you have a petri dish and you have like some kind of single-celled organism on it, and you put some sugar on one end of the petri dish and they just all head in that direction, predictably. Profit and growth is what they're about, and that's why they accomplish the good things that they sometimes accomplish, okay? Because they're simple, not complex. But that means that they're not fit to be political actors in the way that people are. They don't deserve the dignity of that title. And giving it to them has been a terrific mistake. And it's the thing that keeps us from being able to talk rationally about horrible problems. And so part of the climate fight this year is going to be not about pipelines, and not about coal mines, and not about oil wells, and not about fracking sites. Those things will all still be important, and we'll fight them hard. But part of the climate fight, and maybe the heart of it's going to have to be about corporate power. It's going to have to be about figuring out how to get rid, in the first place, of subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, which around the world add up to like $400 billion a year, okay? And these are not subsidies that we would give out for the reason that any economist would say you should give out a subsidy to help some infant industry get up and running, you know, learn to do what it's doing. We've been burning rocks for 300 years. We know how to do it. There's no need to subsidize this behavior, just the opposite, okay? So we've got to take away those things. And then if we have to, we're going to have to figure out, as we've done 27 or 28 times before in this country, how to amend the Constitution to get back to the idea that people are people. And if we do those things, if we do those things, or even if we at least go far enough down that path that we begin to put a dent in the power of corporations, then there's some chance of at least getting them somewhere near the bargaining table and beginning this process of doing things like putting a price on carbon that will let us do what we need to do. Right now, we don't have a prayer. The summer before last, when there were still 60 Democrats in the Senate, there was a tepid, tame, mild, moderate climate bill, as moderate as you could possibly have asked. The first climate bill that even got that far in the Senate. But the Senate was so scared of the power of the fossil fuel industry that they could not even bring themselves to take a vote on that bill. Okay. Could not even bring themselves to take a vote. They were so cowed. And we've got to change that. And it's not going to be, we're not going to do it by, I mean, it's not that senators lack bravery or something. It's that the system is stacked to make that happen. And so we've got to figure out how to get around it. I hope that you will join us at 350.org and in many other forums in figuring out over the next year or two how to do that. It's not going to be easy. It's going to require coalitions with all kinds of other people. It's going to require working across ideological lines. One of the good things we know from polling is that huge numbers of people who identify as Republicans and independents and Democrats all agree that corporations aren't people and don't deserve that kind of power. So we can make some inroads, I think. Maybe. We'll see. Let me end just with two insights from those arrests this summer. First one was, when we sent out this note, I said, I don't think that college students should have to be the cannon fodder here. Okay, it makes more sense for those of us who spend our lives pouring carbon into the atmosphere to have to take on this burden. And anyway, if you're 18 right now in our economy, an arrest record may not be the wisest thing you could possibly have. On the other hand, once you're past a certain age, what the hell are they going to do to you, you know? There are at least a few privileges that come with growing old, no? A few things, very few things that get easier as you get older. And that's how it worked out. I mean, there were young people who came, I knew there would be, but there were a lot of old people. We didn't ask people how old they were, that would be rude, but we asked, who was president when you were born? And the biggest cohorts came from the Truman and FDR administrations, okay? And on the last day, there was a 86-year-old guy arrested, which I think means the Harding administration. And he had a sign around his neck and it said, World War II vet, handle with care. Okay? And that was really, I mean, it was beautiful to see the whole time through. The other thing that was interesting, and I told everybody, if you want to come to get arrested, we'd be grateful if you'd wear a necktie or a dress when you can't. Okay. And the reason is not because I like wearing neckties. I mean, I live in the woods. If I'm wearing a necktie, it usually means there's a funeral going on, you know? So it's not really but I wanted a way to make visually a point that I think is of the utmost importance. And that point is about who the radicals are and who the conservatives are in this fight. We are not the radicals, not by any stretch of the imagination. Radicals are people who will willingly alter the chemical composition of the atmosphere in order to make money. No one has ever come up with something more radical. I mean, if you were writing the next Bond thriller, you know, you would hesitate to have the villain decide he was going to alter the chemical composition of the entire atmosphere, which seems sort of too big, you know, even for a Bond villain. But that's basically what, you know, the CEO of Exxon gets up to do every day, and the guys who run Duke Energy and whatever else it is, you know, that's what they do. They alter the chemical composition of the atmosphere. By contrast, those of us whose main goal is just to have the world look something like it did when we were born onto it are conservatives in this case. Those of us who would like the Constitution to work in somewhat the same way that people thought it might 200 years ago, there were conservatives too, you know. It's important to get that across, I think. Because you really do have to somehow in your heart understand just what a strange and difficult and perverse moment we live in, when the worst thing that ever happened is happening and nothing's being done. Look, I'm going to stop now. I wish I could guarantee you that we were going to win this fight, and I, in all honesty, cannot do that. I don't know. There are scientists who say we have waited too long to get started. Clearly, some of this heating is irreversible. And we run the danger of setting off feedback loops that make it impossible to ever slow it down. But we think that there's maybe still some time not to stop global warming, but to keep it from getting completely out of control. There are political scientists who say the odds are too high, that there's too much money on the other side. So far, they've been right. If you were a betting person, you might be inclined to bet that way. But I think that it's a bet that you're not allowed to make. I think the burden of being a morally awake person when something this bad is happening is to get up in the morning and figure out how you're going to change the odds of that wager. Even if you don't know that it's going to succeed in the end. That's what wagers are, you know? And we can change the odds. I don't know if we're going to win, but I do know, because I've spent the last 4 or 5 years in constant motion around the planet, spewing carbon behind me, it must be said, to pretty much every country on Earth almost, you know. And every place I've gone, there are people, lots of them, willing to stand up and fight, eager to stand up and fight. Many of them, even most of them, in places that really have done nothing to cause this problem, and yet they're willing to work in tandem, in solidarity with those of us who have caused this problem. I'm always moved to be in those rooms, and I'm moved to be in this room tonight, because I know what you all have already done, and I know what you will do, and I just will say I look forward to standing shoulder to shoulder with you and doing it in the years ahead. Thank you all so much.